and basically throw the whole thing, the whole topic open to you for further discussion and for you, asking you to enlighten me, because I feel very much still, I feel a student still in this field. Now my topic is the Kastoria 8 Asmatikon, and I've subtitled it A Middle Byzantine Enigma. And I was introduced to this manuscript many years ago while I was still a graduate student, working under the late Professor Miloš Velimirović, who told me about this manuscript. And he described how he encountered it when Professor Politis, who discovered it, introduced it at one of the Byzantine congresses back, I believe it was the one in London in the mid-1960s, and how it kind of revolutionized our way of looking at Byzantine notation and its development. And Velimirović would frequently ask me in my work with the Comunicare notation, is it the key or is it not? And I would say yes and no. And then he would just kind of go away with a big grin on his face. Anyway, by way of an introduction, I will start by saying, since it's chance discovery, I understand that the legend behind Kastoria 8 was that it was discovered quite accidentally. In 1965, by the Greek philologist Linus Politis, the Kastoria 8 Asmatikon, and hereafter I will just simply call it K8, has stood apart with its unique notational properties. A traditional Asmatikon, or choir book, in its musical style, content, and organization, K8 is distinguished by its peculiar 2 rows of neumes. A lower row of Middle Byzantine neumes, diastematic, fully transcribable by whatever method, overlaid by a row of great hypostases in red, with some even in green. And this is a feature which has no precedent among Greek Byzantine musical sources, as I understand it. Perhaps something else has come to light in the meantime, I'd love to know. The recent accessibility of the manuscript in a new color copy, revealing a better physical condition than originally thought, has cast some new light on its musical properties. Okay. Here I show the folio 58 verso, the Kontakion, mode for plagal, for the Sunday of Orthodoxy, Hoa Perigraptus Logos to Petros, written in its characteristic style. The manuscript is in beautiful condition, perfectly readable, with the lower row of Middle Byzantine neumes and with its peculiar upper row of great hypostases. From the start, largely owing to the late date of its compilation, the 14th century, this manuscript has raised some issues. On the one hand, K8 may be perceived as a bridge linking periods of notational development, as such casting light on earlier practices, the evolution of chanting styles. It begs such questions as, how long does a musical style persist in the wake of historical events and liturgical reforms? On the other hand, this source could just be an anomaly representing the local chanting traditions of the Kastoria Cathedral and its environs. And so this is something that I know very little about, and I would be grateful for anybody to point me in the right direction. So during the time allotted to me, I will offer up a few ideas concerning this manuscript. And what I want to touch on are the following topics. Kastoria 8 and the chronological development of diastematic notation. That's basically an overview. A prospective witness in the preservation of older chanting practices across the Orthodox world. Kastoria 8 and the Paleo-Slavonic Comunicare musical notation. And with some illustrations from hypostasis to ligature on the evolution of a written gesture, how what obviously originated as hieronymic figure becomes written down and assigned a name and a function. And I offer up the idea that it could even have been a pedagogical tool. So just to give a addressing the first topic on my list here, the chronological development, musicologist Simon Harris describes Kastoria 8 as, quote, a complete asmatikon, similar in content to Lavra Gamma 3 or the Grottaferrata Gamma Gamma 1, remarkable for its musical conservatism and for its use of additional hieronomic signs unknown in any other Byzantine manuscript of comparable age, end of quote. Dimitri Konomos further suggests that K8 could represent yet a third melodic strain within the Asmatikon manuscript tradition, the Italo-Greek corpus being the first and the Constantinopolitan Lavra Gamma 3 the second. However, the issues I have with Konomos' statement is that we have so few manuscripts to deal with. Can we actually make that kind of pronouncement? Do we really have enough to work with? I suppose we do have enough to distinguish variants within the Asmatikon tradition. And for example, one distinguishing feature of the K8 choral chants is the absence, for the most part, of the signature double gamma rise as the concluding gesture, as we find in the South Italian sources, the Grottaferrata Gamma Gamma 1, Gamma Gamma 7, Messina 129, Vaticanus Greca 1606, etc. In terms of its content, K8 is comprised of 89 folios with apparent lacunae between folios 77 and 78, and therefore it is an incomplete document. According to Constantine Flores' classification in its general construction and content, K8 concurs with all known copies of what he describes as a pure type asmatikon. That is, it comprises only choral chants and no psaltic or solo repertory. The manuscript, according to Politi's classification and content, is in 7 parts and follows a similar chant arrangement as other copies of the Asmatikon. So we have here from folios 1 recto to 21 recto, the Canonica of the Octoicos. Folios 21 recto to 44 verso, the Canonica of the liturgical year. From folios 44 verso to 68 recto, which contains the core of the material on which I've worked, the Festal Hippakoi of the liturgical year and the Great Troparia for Christmas and Epiphany. At the end of this section, we have the Kontakion in the choral style for the dedication of the church, Hostuanos Stereomatos, Iakovishne Tverdi Blagolepia. At this point, the great signs disappear, and section D, folios 68 verso, 270 recto, the ferial and festal Trisagia. Folios 70 recto to 74 recto, the lesser and greater doge of Prokimena. Folios 75 recto to 80 recto, the Troparia, including 2 Anastasima and the Hippakoi for the feast of the exaltation of the Holy Cross. And finally, folios 80 verso to 89 verso, the end of the manuscript, the Stichia, the Hex of Salmos. So there's a lot of material in this manuscript to work with, and I've enjoyed very much. It's every time I look at a folio of it, I learn something, which kind of casts light on paucity of my own knowledge of this entire subject. Kastoria 8, or K8, and this is my second heading, as I listed above, as witness in the preservation of older chanting practices across the Orthodox world. Firstly, I'd like to address the liturgics supporting this manuscript. To what liturgical tradition does this source belong? Does it represent indigenous chanting practices of the regions at this time, according to whatever liturgical ordinal is in use? At the time of K8's composition, its compilation of the 14th century, the Asmatikon had largely been supplanted by the Colocviilor, a successor to the older chant books and a product of liturgical reforms. And as we know, the examination of the Colocviilor, it had absorbed much of the older repertory of both Asmatikon and Psaltikon. The Russian liturgist Alexei Pentkovsky has proposed a liturgical framework for the existence of K8 as a musical exponent of the shared liturgical observances of the region. K8, albeit late, could be a byproduct of that network of residual chanting practices connecting the Greek enclaves of Calabria and Messina through the Slavic lands, the eparchy of Ohrid, and even as far north to Novgorodian Rus during this period. Indeed, Penkovsky speaks of this region as a contact zone, where a Studite-type liturgical ordinal regulated the services, and with which we associate the Asmatikon manuscript type and choral chanting practices. Now, this is a little bit of a gloss, but and it requires much more fleshing out in discussion. So I took it upon myself to examine some of the big signs, and being rather reluctant to paste labels on things, but I've been intrigued by how some of these signs, some of these figures seem to be passed from one manuscript type to another, and crossing linguistic barriers in terms of their introduction and appearance in the Slavic manuscripts. So, for example, as I pull up this example here, some of these figures are uncannily similar. K8's most outstanding feature is, of course, its musical notation, and folios, as aforementioned, folios 1 rectors, 68 versos have chants notated with this signature 2 rows of signs. And just as a reminder, 68 verso, 89 verso are written in a different hand, and the large signs have disappeared. The examples I have brought up here show some aspects of K8's pneumatic system in comparison with some manuscripts that are older and contemporaneous. As they occur in the manuscripts, all are employed in various combinations with small signs, which would, of course, provide melodic definition, rhythm, and nuance, ornamentation, etc. At first glance, K8's large signs display their hieronomic origins. One can imagine them being formed in the air and bear an uncanny resemblance not only to the old Chartres neumes in their oldest manifestations, we'll see some of that in the next example, but as the example shows here, figures that appear in the few scant sources of Middle Bulgarian provenance from the same time period and region. In this instance, as we see in the second figure, the 13th century Draganov Manayan or Zograski Trifolog, and also shown as a similar sign from as early as the 11th century from the Typografsky Ustav from Rus. And whether this sign is providing the same musical function is one of the great unknowns. Really are in terra incognita here, and it's something that one can spend a lifetime on and never really penetrate it at all. In a second illustration, I've isolated 3 hypostasis formulae, and which I've identified as first from the list of the manuscript Lavragama 67, the Synagma, as it appears in almost identical form in Kastoria 8, and in its spelling out from the later manuscripts, EBE 2444, from the later part of the 14th century. The second figure I pull out here is again from Lavragama 67, Rapisma, also called Colocviilmos, as I understand, as it occurs almost everywhere in Kastoria 8, and it's spelling out from the same manuscript. And finally, the Strangisma from the older manuscript, as it occurs in Kastoria 8, with almost always consistently in the chants that I've looked at, occurring with the same small signs and showing the same motion, and I have put a little box in the transcription there to show the defining figure of the strangisma. In my comparisons with Kandakarian musical notation, this sign almost consistently corresponds with the Kandakarian figure stavros, or a cross with 5 short lines, which one of the Russian musicologists described as the 5 fingers, and as acknowledged also its hieronomic origins. And the problem here is, how does a strangisma go from this figure to 5 short lines? That's a mystery question, a puzzle that we'll never be able to figure out. As I've noted, the colophismos frequently occurs as a final cadential figure in Kastoria, and and it occurs regardless of mode or genre. It's just one figure that seems to end most of the chants. If we can trust our identifications, K8 does indeed bear witness to the continued use of the archaic large signs in later practice. There is a definite need for the creation of a systematic catalog of the Kastorian neumes, many of which can be identified by their Chartres cognates, forms as recorded in such sources as Lambergamma 67, and their composing out in the later didactic poems, 14th century and beyond, of Glikis and Kukazelis. Resources that, if we step back and look, span a chronology of 400 years. To the heart of my work, I suppose, Kastoria 8 and Kandakarian musical notation. At the time of its sensational discovery, K8 was touted as the long-lost key to the deciphering of the Paleo-Slavonic Kandakarian musical notation. A pronouncement, alas, made without taking into full account the obvious important disparities between the manuscripts, as well as age and provenance. How on earth does a tradition from the Macedonian regions end up in northern Russia, and vice versa? Kandakarian notation shares with K8 the disposition of those 2 rows of neumes over a text that has been distorted with non-textual intercalations. So in a decades-long, rigorous test of comparative transcription theories for Russian Kandakarian musical notation, I've made extensive use of this manuscript. K8's unique notational properties have established it as an invaluable tool in our attempts at identifying the Kandakarian neumes. For comparative analysis with their medieval Slavic counterparts, K8 shares sizable corpus of chants with the large signs, which bear an uncanny, even filial resemblance to the Kandakarian hypostases, particularly those of the 12th century Blagoveshensky Kandakar. And it is possible these sources could have descended from an antigraph, common antigraph. So for example, so some of my comparative work here, from hypostasis to ligature, taken a line from the same chant from the Kantakian Hippokoi for the Sunday of Orthodoxy from the 11th century typographical stuff, and laid it alongside with a tentative transcription under the 5-line staff from Kastoria 8. And the resemblance is uncannily obvious. The K8 line seems to conflate those individual large signs that we see in the Kandakarian line as a ligature representing a sweeping hieronomic gesture. It's really quite beautiful what we see. The graphic similarities among K8, Kandakarian grade signs, as well as Chartres neumes, are apparent, yet the result of comparative analysis yields really only a set of notational correspondences. And a correspondence does not necessarily constitute an identification and may only represent an approximation of a correlative musical melodic figure. Indeed, for every figure tentatively identified through this type of comparative analysis with K8, with a K8 counterpart, there is an equal number that cannot be reconciled and that are completely dissimilar. And so the identification of many Colocviilor hypostases via those in K8 has nonetheless contributed to our knowledge and understanding of the stability and dissemination of melodic formula as far as we can trust it, and for those chants that we know, and along with certain repertories throughout the Eastern Christian world. So, while offering up some clues to Kandakarian musical notation, K8 is not the long-lost, sought-after Rosetta Stone for the Kandakar. It could still represent, at the same time, an anachronistic missing link in the transmission of the choral repertory with hieronymy. Its use as a key to the decipher of the Kandakarian neumes, however, has proven limited, as I've shown. Its repertory, with 3 small exceptions, excludes Kontakia, choral settings of which apparently had long vanished from this manuscript type, and a feature which, the absence of Kontakia is a feature K8 shares with the contents of all other extant copies of the Byzantine choir book. In the end, K8 still poses more questions than answers. The last point I'd like to touch on is K8 is a pedagogical tool, and I'm trying to find the why of this manuscript. Why did it appear when it did, and for what purpose? And to address how such a source is used in performance, like the Kandakar, K8 was probably a book of the domesticus, wherein the large signs were likely employed as mnemonic devices and used to direct singers who had learned the repertory by rote, by oral tradition. We have to always factor in, when we're dealing with old repertory, the role of oral tradition. Another possible theory for the appearance of the large signs in this late copy of the Asmatikon, despite of the fact that the hieronymic gestures had been subordinated by hypostasis. Let me show my final example here. There's the sign taken from folio 21 recto, showing the all too familiar hieronymic hand symbol. That we, in spite of the fact that the hieronymic gestures had been subordinated as hypostases with the advent of diastomy, the source could also have been created for pedagogical purposes. That is, the signs may have been added later for the training of psalte in the art of hieronymy. Yet one may ask in practice whether these complicated gestures by hand in air could really be comprehended by a chorus of the best professional singers. Finally, is another possibility, and I tossed this one out a little bit glibly perhaps, is that the manuscript could also have been created to satisfy the needs of an inherently Slavic demographic of the region of that time, witness spelling anomalies, that it is not in the best Greek. The appearance of 2 rows of neumes was also unique to Slavic chanting practices at the time, perhaps known from a much earlier period, and that is a stretch, unfortunately. To sum up, excuse me, conservative in every respect, where does this manuscript stand among the corpus of late Byzantine / Balkan manuscripts in the transmission of chants and manuscript development? Does it have any relationship with manuscripts created at the same time in terms of shared repertory and in use in the various chanting centers around the Balkans, I'd like to ask? What is its significance for the region, in other words? As a choral chant book, the K8 Asmatikon is at the very least an anachronism, having appeared a century after the heyday of the Byzantine choir book. Its late date also positions it a century after the disappearance of the Kandakarian tradition in Rus, which vanished sometime in the 13th century, as Rus at the time underwent its own changes in the wake of historical events and liturgical reforms. At the same time, K8's existence invites the possibility that it is an archaic residual link to earlier traditions. In other words, a leftover. To restate comments written in earlier studies concerning a reconciliation of musical styles with the disparity in the notations, that is, Paleo-Byzantine, Middle Byzantine, and Kandakarian, one encounters formidable difficulties and unanswerable questions. At the same time, K8 could still hold a mirror up to an earlier period. Kastoria and its environs, along with the Greek cloisters of southern Italy, and Rus, existed well on the periphery of the Byzantine Empire, distant from the centers of progressive change, like Constantinople, like Thessalonica. In a bid to uphold well-established local traditions, there was slow or perhaps even resistance to change taking place at the empire's heart, preferring to follow their own path, their own local traditions. And as the late Kenneth Levy long ago stated, quote, "The overriding rule is that received materials undergo idiomatic remodeling wherever they are, and musical distance from a model is no sure measure of historical distance," end of quote. Such could have been the case for both Rus and the territories around Kastoria, where musical development followed its own path and rate of development. Whatever its origins and role, its very existence could inch us a bit closer to solving some of the paleographical mysteries of Eastern Christianity's musical past. Thank you.
Two.
There.
Well, thank you so much, dear Mr. Myers, for this very interesting presentation about this very peculiar manuscript, K8. Yes, very, very interesting. Also with this correlations with the Slavonic word, with the Slavic word, and also with the Chartres notation and the Hieronomy and the pedagogy and so on. It's really a very challenging source.
It is.
Yes. Are there any questions for Mr. Myers?
Just a little.
Yes, please.
Observation that. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Oh.
Yes.
I found also some extra signs, like the hand you shown, in Putna manuscripts, but I don't think they have a special meaning, at least in Putna manuscripts. They, for example, in the Cucumas Polieleos, if I remember well, they show a moment where you can stop the chanting, shorting the chant. So
Okay.
it's a too long Alleluia verse, and they cut it there, and they put a hand sign or sometimes a flower. Sometimes it's
some sort of stop.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. As I understood it, because all the time you'll find this in that moment where you can stop the verse, the singing, you know, to enshorten a little.
Right, right. Mainly for practical reasons.
Yes.
Yes.
But also could be in pedagogical purposes. Who knows? Yes. I mean in Kastoria.
Right, right. Yes. Though, as I mentioned, the problem I have with Kastoria, and I remember a wonderful paper given in Finland a few years by Akaleas Kaleakis about the origins of notation, all notation in Hieronomy, and even signing simple signs like an ison. It's complicated to relate to a gesture in the air to what you're supposed to be singing. And when I see the almost virtual wildness of the Castorian signs, I thought, how could anybody follow that? I mean, from a practical chanting point of view. So I really kind of wonder about it.
I think this was very interesting to show the signs and then the ligatures, which can occur by unifying those, and then you have the gesture of the very gesture of the hand written down, drawn down on the manuscript. So this was a very interesting idea. I wonder, Annalisa Doneda did a lot of work in trying to classify the neumes found in Kastoria 8 and also Konstantinos Floros.
Yes.
Yeah.
Floris's work has been absolutely exhaustive. I do stop a little bit at some of his conclusions saying, this is the manuscript, this is it, but his method is absolutely exhaustive and quite amazing. I am acquainted with Doneda's work. I did meet with her some years ago But unfortunately, she stopped. I was trying to encourage her to keep working with the manuscript. Let's see what else you could do. But alas, the project came to an end.
Yes, yes. But I think that this is the right way of putting in it between the Comunicare notation and the Chartres notation, and then the all research about hieronymy. It's very interesting. Also here in Greece, many people affirm that it must have been the book of the choir leader, of the domesticos. The hieronymies have been written down there. I wonder also about Colaphismos and Rapisma. I think Rapisma is something else than Colaphismos. Colaphismos is that formula you had from 2444, that it's a whole chain of neumes. And
yes,
then Rapisma, yes, and the Rapisma, according to Floros, is just the ligature between apostrophos and klasma. So it's something, although they are synonyms in Greek, they mean the same. I mean, to give, but not musically. It's some. There are two different things, as far as I could understand from the. Yeah.
That's very interesting. This is where my own background comes up a bit short. I was mainly basing that on the graphic shape of the sign, that gesture like this that it occurs. And what I found particularly remarkable, and I discovered it quite late, is that looking at whatever the Kastorian chant is, they all end the same. They all have the same concluding figure. And I thought, why is that? And so I was wondering if that is possible. The same thing is happening in the Comunicarian chants, but that has its own major issue.
Yes, yes, yes. I think those should be studied together. And as to the hands, with the hieronymic gestures, there are lots of them also in autographs by Grigorios Bounis Aliatis, both close to the initials of a chant and on some margins. So it just gives a beautiful atmosphere. I don't know whether it refers directly to a chant or to a different sign. So there are some manuscripts where they used to design hands, and it can be also very beautiful and very compelling.
It's absolutely worth a look.
Yeah.
I'm actually have been kind of regenerated with the availability, the digitization initiatives taken by most of the holdings where these manuscripts are, particularly the Slavic ones, that I now have access to things, and we are able to revise a lot of our theories of what we know. So
yes.
Say onward.
Yes, yes, yes. I think we just have go on to work with.